In a quiet neighborhood nestled at the edge of a forest, there lived a young boy named Alex. His family's house, modest and unassuming, sat at the very end of the street, its backyard blending into the thick woods that stretched for miles. Alex was a quiet child, not particularly out of the ordinary, except for one unsettling thing. From a very young age, Alex would often be found staring at the trees outside his window, his eyes fixed and distant, as though he could see something that no one else could. It started small. He'd press his face against the window, his tiny hands cupping the glass, his gaze scanning the dark edges of the forest. There was a stillness about him, a tension, as though he were waiting for something. His parents would call to him from the kitchen or living room, but Alex never responded. His eyes never left the woods. Over time, the behavior grew more pronounced. Alex began to withdraw from others, preferring solitude, staying inside during the day. His parents, concerned, would find him sitting at the window, motionless, staring. The longer he stayed there, the more the air around him seemed to shift. A quiet unease began to settle over the house, a sense that something was amiss, but neither his mother nor father could place it. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting long, distorted shadows across the yard, Alex sat at the back window again. His body stiff, his eyes wide and unblinking, he stared into the darkening forest. The air felt thick and heavy, pressing down on everything around him. The sky, once vibrant with the warm colors of sunset, seemed to deepen into an unnatural, almost sickly hue. There was a subtle change in the way the trees moved, as if the wind itself were hesitant, uncertain. The usual rustling of leaves was muted, distant, as though muffled by something unseen. Alex's eyes twitched slightly, but he didn't blink. His gaze locked on a particular spot in the forest. For a long while there was only silence, broken only by the soft creak of the house settling and the faint rustling outside. But then the air grew colder. The night stretched on. His parents, unaware of the tension in the room, continued their nightly routines, moving about the house. But as they passed by Alex, a sense of wrongness lingered in the air, like a thick fog that only they couldn't see. Alex didn't move. Hours passed. The clock ticked steadily on the wall. Then the first noise came, a low, distant scraping, like something heavy dragging against the earth. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder. The sound began to shift, moving slowly toward the house. It wasn't the wind, nor was it an animal. It was something far too deliberate. Alex's body remained still, rigid as a statue. His eyes remained locked on the spot in the woods where the shadow had passed. The scraping grew louder, closer. It echoed through the house as though the very ground beneath their feet was shifting. The darkness outside deepened, swallowing the trees, the yard, everything that was once familiar. The house seemed to grow colder, and a thick silence filled every corner. Alex's eyes slowly moved, following something unseen. His breathing, once steady, now became shallow, quick, as if he could sense the presence of something beyond the walls, something drawing closer. A gust of wind howled through the trees, shaking the branches, sending the shadows into a frantic dance. But this wind was different, unnatural, as if something was moving through it, something that shouldn't be there. The scraping sound came again, louder now, and then there was a soft thud, a heavy, muffled thump against the side of the house. A soft, wet sound, like something large and cold pressing against the walls, moving slowly, deliberately. The trees outside groaned, their branches twisting as if reaching toward the house. Suddenly there was movement in the yard. The air felt thicker, as if something was rising from the earth itself. Alex's body tensed even further. His gaze never wavered, his eyes locked on something just beyond the tree line. His small fingers curled against the glass, as if he wanted to break through it, to get closer to what was coming. The ground outside began to crack. Slowly, inch by inch, deep fissures appeared in the soil, Something massive was emerging. The earth groaned under its weight. Something was crawling out of the earth. Thin, long, twisted fingers reached up, scraping through the soil, leaving trails of blackened dirt in their wake. The hands were not human, too long, too slender, and then came the faces, horrible, twisted things, not human faces, but something else. The faces were not right. They seemed to shift and distort as if they were made of shadows, but with eyes that were cold and ancient, filled with a darkness that no human could ever understand. The figures moved toward the house, their bodies unnaturally elongated, slithering across the ground like something crawling from a nightmare. They were not walking, they were dragging themselves, their limbs bending in unnatural ways, scraping along the dirt, leaving deep marks in the earth. Inside the house, Alex's parents were frozen in place, their attention suddenly drawn to the window. They saw nothing at first, just the wind in the trees and the fading light of dusk. But then, there it was, a shift in the shadows. Figures moved through the trees. The shapes were wrong, too long, too thin, their forms impossibly contorted. And they were coming closer. The ground shook, the walls trembled. The scraping outside grew louder, closer. The house seemed to groan as though it too could sense the approaching presence. The air grew cold, suffocating, and the lights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Alex stood at the window, his gaze never leaving the figures emerging from the earth. The shapes surrounded the house, their twisted, featureless faces staring through the windows with an intensity that made the room feel like a tomb. The figures moved with terrible, unearthly precision, as though they knew exactly where they were going, exactly who they were coming for. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, there was silence. The air was still, the house was still, but the darkness outside had deepened, grown stronger, more oppressive. The ground had split open and the figures had emerged, watching, waiting. Alex was gone, but the house remained, silent, empty. The air, once thick with dread, had settled into an unnatural calm. And outside, deep in the woods, the figures stood, watching the house, watching the street, watching everything. And if you listened closely, if you dared to look too long, you might see them too. They had always been there, just waiting for someone to look long